So on Passover, we are commanded to retell the Exodus story, the story of our ancestors' enslavement and fight for freedom in Egypt. Each year, we hold a Seder, a meal throughout which we retell this important story. During the Seder, when we get to the part of the story where Moses repeatedly goes to Pharaoh to make demands for his people's liberation, and Pharaoh says no again and again, we dip a finger into our wine and drip a drop of wine onto our Seder plates as we read out the 10 plagues God brought on the people of Egypt. This year, at my Seder, after we finished reciting the 10 plagues, we continued going around the table naming modern plagues until our plates were nearly covered in drops of wine. Plagues such as homelessness, for-profit healthcare, mass incarceration, deportation, the suppression of free speech, the genocide in Gaza, climate catastrophe, the defunding of our education, and the proposed $880 billion cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. I know I'm not alone in feeling like we are living through plague after plague after plague. The Passover story also tells us that in between each plague, after Moses goes up to Pharaoh's palace and demands liberation in a series of escalating demands, first for the freedom of a group to go out into the wilderness for a few days and pray to their God, but eventually for the freedom for all Israelites and anyone else who wants to come with them to leave the bondage of slavery in Egypt, that after each of these demands, God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he says no. It's hard to understand why this is included. Surely God would want the people to be free, so why harden Pharaoh's heart? Why do the plagues get so bad that eventually even Pharaoh's own son is killed? Another prophet from our own struggle for freedom in America might have insight into why. Frederick Douglass, in his speech addressing the Dred Scott decision, says, "Loud and exultingly have we been told that the slavery question is settled and settled forever. We remember it was settled 37 years ago when Missouri was admitted into the Union with a slaveholding constitution and slavery prohibited in all territory north of 36 degrees of north latitude. Just 15 years afterwards, it was settled again by voting down the right of petition and gagging down free discussion in Congress. 10 years after this, it was settled again by the annexation of Texas, and with it, the war with Mexico. In 1850, it was settled again. This was called a final settlement. By it, slavery was virtually declared to be the equal of liberty and should come into the Union on the same terms. By it, the right and the power to hunt down men, women, and children in every part of this country was conceded to our Southern brethren in order to keep them in the Union. 4 years after this settlement, the whole question was once more settled, and settled by a settlement which unsettled all former settlements. The fact is, the more the question has been settled, the more it has needed settling. The space between the different settlements has been strikingly on the decrease. And only a few short years after this speech, civil war and the fight for total abolition of slavery in America would erupt. Maybe the Torah tells us that God hardens Pharaoh's heart because the ruling class, whether the pharaohs of old or of today, will always fight to the bitter end for the preservation of their profit and power. Frederick Douglass continues to say that the slaveholders, the ruling class, their motto is a firmer hold and a tighter grip for every new effort that is made to break their cruel power. The case is one of life or death with them, and they will give up only when they must do that or do worse. Despite the firmer hold and tighter grip, both Moses and Frederick Douglass did not settle for concessions. They did not settle for the abolition of slavery for some. They did not settle for reforms or empty gestures or words. And what's more, in the midst of the plagues, the settlements that Douglass spoke of, they organized. The Torah specifically mentions that Moses gathered the heads of the families of the Israelites and spoke to them to prepare to leave, that they talked to their neighbors and friends, and that eventually it wasn't only the Israelites who gained their freedom, but a whole mixed multitude went with them. Many of us are here tonight because we have dedicated our lives to the fight to end poverty. As part of the Nonviolent Medicaid Army, we met the plague of Biden's cutting 25 million people off of Medicaid with the demand that no one lose their Medicaid. With the threat of the 880 billion cuts, likely entailing work requirements and even more millions of Americans cut from Medicaid, we need to not just demand no one be cut, but demand an expansion of Medicaid to all Americans unfairly excluded already. And when the ruling class ultimately says no, we should not relent, but continue to organize. Another prophet, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would say in his 1967 speech, A Time to Break Silence, that true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Our demand cannot be that every beggar receives a coin. Our demand must be for something the system cannot provide without fundamental transformation, the complete and total abolition of poverty. I'm sure it was not easy for the Israelites to organize as they lived through the plagues, just as there is so much horror and violence being inflicted on our class today. Yesterday, I went out canvassing with the Massachusetts Nonviolent Medicaid Army, and while it was a success, sometimes it can feel demoralizing when we only talk to a few people, especially in the face of how much work we have to do. But both Moses and Frederick Douglass would remind us not to feel hopeless. Douglass, in reflecting on the abolition movement, said, "It started small and was without capital, either in men or money. The odds were all against it. It literally had nothing to lose and everything to gain. There was ignorance to be enlightened, error to be combated, conscience to be awakened, prejudice to be overcome, apathy to be aroused, the right of speech to be secured, mob violence to be subdued, and a deep, radical change to be inwrought in the mind and heart of the whole nation. This great work under God has gone on and gone on gloriously. So too will our movement for the abolition of poverty." Amen.